Chapter 8 in the ServSafe material is one that they don't spend enough time on, in my opinion, so I'm going to start with that one now. The key elements of talking about a food safety management system are to identify a variety of different practices and procedures. It's not just one thing, and then to take an active involvement in controlling those risks and hazards. This picture is one of my favorites, sent to me by a student who was working for an environmental health department, and those are all things that were pulled out of that floor drain that's right there in the picture. So there was some failure in their food safety management system in terms of the cleanliness of the area. I thought that was a pretty amazing image. There are different parts to the foundation of a food safety management system. The first is a strong personal hygiene program. So it's important that you have both policies, facilities, and resources in order to make this happen, and that it's supported by you. That you provide food safety training for staff, and that you choose suppliers and specify your products carefully and according to the policies of your organization. And then finally, that you have some kind of quality control and assurance program where you monitor and keep track of how you're doing in all of these different areas. Within food safety management, you also have to have a strong and consistent cleaning and sanitation program. You need standard operating procedures, or known as SOPs, that support that and the other aspects of the program, meaning that you don't just tell someone, oh, go wash that or go clean that. You actually have in writing the method and the products and the responsibilities associated with cleaning. And then you also have some kind of equipment maintenance program along with sort of the overall design of the facility, but primarily keeping your equipment maintained so that someone checks gaskets and checks hinges and checks for leaks to make sure that things stay in good repair rather than waiting for something to break down. This is also known as preventive maintenance. And then a pest control program is usually something that's done on a contracted basis with an outside vendor, again, to control and keep pests out, along with good practices in the operation to keep the environment clean so that pests aren't attracted. So it's really a two-way street, and the video will talk much more about that. The most common risks that need to be attended to when you're trying to control and protect from foodborne illness have to do with purchasing food, failing to cook food adequately, holding food at the improper temperatures, using contaminated equipment, and practicing poor personal hygiene. These are really 5 focus areas for protecting in the food safety area. The idea of active managerial control is critically important. Again, I can't emphasize enough that the greatest policies in the world are only as good as how they're supported by management. Supervision by managers and shift leads, ongoing training programs, not something that just happens once a year, but periodic training to remind employees of different responsibilities, and then having standard operating procedures that are clearly conveyed to employees are critically important. And then finally, a HACCP program, which we'll talk about in more detail in just a minute. All of these things are critically important, particularly the monitoring and verifying part. The FDA has some specific recommendations related to the topics on this slide. They feel it's particularly important that a manager should be able to explain both to an inspector and also to their staff how to keep food safe. Being a ServSafe certified food protection manager is one way to do that. There should be procedures in place to be sure that staff are practicing good personal hygiene, that there's an illness reporting system, that hand washing is emphasized as a way of controlling the transmission of either disease or contaminants, and in particular that there are procedures to protect the bare hand contact with ready-to-eat food in most instances, that there's time and temperature limits and policies to make sure that food is either cooled properly, heated properly, or held properly to minimize time in the danger zone, and that if you cook food or serve food that's undercooked, that there are advisories on your menu that identify that. And of course, in the healthcare world, that would not be an issue. This relates more specifically to restaurants. HACCP is a newer, it's been around for a while, but it is relatively new system that is based on identifying the hazards. It stands for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Points, and looking to see what are the points in the flow of food through an operation where a biological, a chemical, or a physical hazard could put that food at risk. Once we've identified those hazards can be prevented or eliminated, or at least reduced or minimized. And I posted this picture here just to give you some thought about what you might see in this picture that could be a potential hazard. In order to be effective, a HACCP system should be carefully planned and individualized for a particular facility. You cannot adopt them across the board. You need to have a system that is unique to your facility, and it should be, once it's developed, it should be written so that it can be explained and trained to everyone involved in the facility. The 7 steps are these: conduct the hazard analysis, determine the critical control points, and I'll elaborate on what those are in just a minute, establish your critical limits, establish monitoring procedures, identify the corrective actions that might need to be taken, verify that the system works, and then establish a system for record keeping and documenting that you're doing all of those things. The first principle is to conduct a hazard analysis. Start with a particular recipe that includes a potentially hazardous food, and then look at the different steps that it goes through until it's finally served and consumed by the consumer. As it goes through that particular flow of food, you can identify the places in the flow where a risk might be present and identify that that is a potential hazard. Then you determine what are those critical control points. What is the point in that step? Is it when the product was purchased? Was it during receiving? Was it storage, preparing, cooking, or serving? Those are the usual steps. You could have a cooling step in there. You could have a reheating step in there, depending on the nature of your product. But there could also be more than one critical control point. In fact, probably will be more than one critical control point at each step in the process. I'm going to pause here and I'll come back with the rest in a moment.